Welcome to another episode of our video series of the mechanics of human cognition. You know, it's pretty much impossible to ignore the news these days, isn't it? Seems like every other day there's another story about some complex financial scam. And it's grim, for sure. But it's also fascinating because it really makes you look past all the numbers and ask a much bigger, much more fundamental question about us.
Exactly. This really isn't just about greed or a few bad apples. This gets at the oldest question there is. Are we basically good or are we basically evil? But you know, that's kind of the wrong question to ask. The real puzzle is why good people, people you and I would consider normal, trustworthy, are capable of doing truly terrible things. And the answer isn't some simple switch inside them that flips from good to bad. It's way more complicated. It's in the systems we create and the incredible pressures those systems put on us.
So before we can even get into it, we've got to have some kind of working definition. Good and evil aren't these fixed, absolute forces. They're labels, and they're defined almost entirely by context. In most situations, we'd all agree that an act that hurts life or crushes diversity is evil. But think about wartime. The very same act can be reframed as a necessary good for the survival of your group. The action itself doesn't change. What changes is the story we tell ourselves about it, and that changes everything.
Right, and that leads to this idea. Think of it like a long line of dominoes. Our first instinct is always to blame the very last domino that falls. That's the individual. But that's a huge mistake. If you really want to understand why it fell, you can't just look at the last piece. You have to look at the entire chain that came before it. Our biological wiring, the pressures from our environment, and the cultural stories that someone pushed to set the whole thing in motion. The final act isn't the cause, it's the result.
Okay, so let's talk about the actual hardware we're all running. Biologically, our physiology is that of a predator. Our eyes face forward to track prey, and our brains are wired for high-stress, split-second decisions for survival. This chart here just perfectly captures the fundamental conflict of being a human today. We're running this ancient, impulsive operating system designed for a hunter-gatherer world, but we're trying to use it in a modern world that demands patience, long-term planning, and collaboration. It's a total mismatch.
And this biological hardware has a kind of psychological ghost. It's what the psychologist Carl Jung famously called the shadow self. That's our inner predator. And Jung's warning here is just so profound. If you don't consciously look at and acknowledge that reactive, primitive part of yourself, it will run your life from the background, especially when you're under pressure. You'll end up making choices out of fear and a sense of scarcity, and you'll just call it fate.
Okay, so we've got this tension inside each of us. But what happens when you scale it up to the level of a whole society? Well, we can actually get some clues from computational models that simulate group behavior. So first, imagine a society made up only of completely self-serving people. The result, every single time, is total collapse. Without any trust or cooperation to hold things together, the system basically just eats itself.
But here's where it gets really strange. You'd think the opposite would be true, right? A society of pure altruists, where everyone is completely selfless. Well, that society collapses even faster. And why? Because it becomes a sitting duck. It has no competitive drive, no selfish impulse to innovate, to defend itself, or to adapt when faced with an outside threat. It's just too nice to survive.
And this all leads to a really mind-blowing conclusion. Long-term, stable societies aren't built by getting rid of selfishness or evil. They're built on a dynamic and, let's be honest, an uncomfortable balance. A healthy society seems to need a majority of people who cooperate to build the structure, but it also needs a minority of selfish actors to challenge it, to innovate, and to push it forward. These opposing forces, they aren't a bug in the system. They're the essential feature.
So this brings us to what might be the most potent force in all of human history. See, the greatest evils we've ever seen aren't just the result of simple selfishness. They happen when our inner predator gets harnessed by a powerful story, an ideological narrative. This is a story that simplifies the world and promises a perfect future. And in doing so, it justifies just about anything for the sake of that greater good.
In these destructive stories, they have a very predictable playbook. You can see the warning signs right here. They always create an outgroup, an other, to blame for everything. They promise some kind of utopia that justifies any atrocity you commit today. And, crucially, they demand absolute loyalty and crush any form of dissent. This is the exact mechanism that turns ordinary people into monsters. I mean, think about the Nazi architect Albert Speer. He wasn't some raving madman, he was a true believer, completely convinced that the horrific things he was doing were serving a noble, world-changing purpose.
So when you look at the broad sweep of history, from ancient empires clashing to modern global conflicts, you start to realize something. We're not really seeing clashes between different groups of people. We are seeing clashes between the stories that those people live inside of. The real conflict is between the narratives themselves.
Now, this all sounds pretty deterministic, but this is where it all comes back to you, to the individual, because this is where the cycle can be broken. This is the human superpower. Unlike any other animal on the planet, we can perform metacognition. We can think about our own thinking. We can become aware of our own programming. We can question the stories we've been told our whole lives, and we can consciously choose to act differently. This isn't just a neat trick, it is our fundamental responsibility.
Just stop and think about how profound that is for a second. There is no other creature that can look at its own behavior, recognize its flaws, and consciously decide to become something better. The ability to say those simple words, "I was wrong and I will change," that isn't just a skill. It is the very engine of all human progress, for ourselves and for our entire civilization. It is the act of rising above our own biology.
So, in the end, we're all left with this dual inheritance. The wiring for both creation and destruction, for cooperation and for predation. It's baked right into our DNA. The defining question of any human life, then, isn't about the nature you were given. It's about the character you choose to build.